and thank you for viewing the recording of our community forum held on the evening of August 3rd, 2020. I'm Superintendent Tim Pavovar, and I was joined in this forum by Jill Geiser, Assistant Superintendent, Robin Holsor, Director of Finance and Operations, and Patricia Ortiz, Family and Community Outreach Specialist. In the forum, you'll see that there was a presentation done where questions and answers were incorporated both into the presentation and presented afterwards. Here's the list of topics. Unfortunately, due to a technical issue, the recording only starts partway through the first item under a review of guiding beliefs and principles. To view videos about those topics in particular, we encourage you to look at our video reopening series that can be found on the district's website under our reopening plans. Here, video 1 will talk about the guiding beliefs, and video 2 will talk about a balanced view of risk, where our recording starts. Thank you, and please enjoy the forum. We talk about the lack of access to essential services. Students rely on school for mental health support, for speech and language pathology, for occupational and physical therapy, and for access to special education services in general. We know the impact that schools play on parental employment. We know that there are families in our community where if there is not an option for their children to go to school, then they may be at risk of losing employment, and what the financial and shelter and safety impacts are on the families in that situation. We know the issue as it relates to nutritional insecurity. I know that we've been continuing to service students in the community with meals during the time of this closure. An incredible thanks to our nutrition services staff. Last week, we served over 32,000 meals to the families in this community and more than 310,000 meals since the pandemic started. So we know the role that schools play in feeding children. And there's also the impact of reduced detection of child abuse. Schools are mandated reporters. We serve as mandated reporters, and nationwide, when we look at the data, reports of abuse, suspected abuse have gone down, but hospitalizations have gone up. And we know that these risks impact different families differently. And so when we think about our options and our thoughts for returning to school, we want to make sure that we're reflective of the fact that we need to provide some choice and some options whenever possible to know that this is going to be impactful to different families in different ways. And so our goal is that we want to focus on supporting the return of students to school with new safety requirements, while knowing that we also need to provide a remote learning experience for some students who are not physically returning to school. And we need to prepare to adapt to the learning model to respond to what's happening from an evolving public health perspective. So let me take a few moments to talk about PPE hygiene and cleaning, just for some baseline sense of some logistical stuff here. We know back in the spring the difficulty with supply chains is related to getting PPE and other supplies. And we know that the guidance calls for families and staff to provide their own masks. We know that one mask will certainly not be enough, but as a good faith effort and with helping provisioning, we're going to be providing a Billerica branded cloth mask with a Billerica B on it to every student and staff member to help with that provisioning. And I'm just going to mention here to Jill or Pat or Robin, if there are questions related to some of these items, please feel free to throw them in the chat or interrupt me at any time with questions. So, I'm not going to read everything that's on this list, but I'm going to share it up on the screen. This is a partial list of items that we've procured in the district already. I want to mention the large backpack and hand electrostatic sprayers. They essentially, what happens is we use sprayers, they electrostatically attach to surfaces, they kill the virus on contact. It's a very quick way to clean and disinfect, or at least to kill the virus in spaces, and allows our custodial staff to move at a much more rapid pace than they would be if doing everything by hand. At this point, we've procured over 15,000 disposable face masks. We know we need to have, them on hand. 13,000 nitrile gloves, hand sanitizer. We're in the process of replacing water bubblers with bottle fillers, hand sanitizer used in our hallways. And I do want to point out, for example, the transparent face masks for students that may be in special education who need to read facial cues, for our deaf and hard of hearing students, and for our English language learners that we have those transparent face masks as well. In addition, to our nurse's office, we've got surgical masks, no-touch thermometers, face shields, isolation gowns, gloves, hand sanitizers, goggles, stethoscopes, and lab coats for every school. Again, we are really wanting to make sure that we are well stocked for what we need for any kind of a physical return to school, both for the general population and in our medical suites as well. I also want to take a moment and talk about transportation guidance. This came out recently from the Department of Education. All students are going to be required to wear masks on buses, and students should be seated one per bench. Windows are kept open all times, and students are assigned to a single bus and seat, but students from the same household can sit together. I will mention that earlier today, the school committee, as well as members of our district-wide working group, are actually, we did a visit to our schools. We took a ride in the school bus just to get that experience ourselves for that perspective. One of the things I just want to mention, because I see this in the Q&A, people are raising their hands. We're not taking live questions audibly, so we're not going to recognize hands that are being raised. But if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A and we'll work to answer it that way. Continuing on the transportation guidance, we use 71 and 77 passenger buses in the district, but the guidance of sitting students one per seat limits our capacity to about 23 or 25 students, which is about a third of what it typically is. You can see below, that's a diagram from the DESE guidance that shows 23 students on a 71 passenger vehicle with a driver, with a monitor, which we're looking at the options for monitors right now, and how students would be distributed along that bus. Okay, just looking to see if there are any questions from our panel. Jill or Pat or Robin, again, feel free to jump in if there's questions that came in. I know I did see a question that came in ahead of time that somebody asked about siblings sitting together in the same seat. Does that impact the ability for somebody to sit in front or behind? That's a good question. It was actually raised when we had our same tour today. We're looking for clarification from DESE on that front, so we don't have an answer for you on that today, but we'll get that answer as we move forward. We'll take a few moments. We got a lot of questions in advance about how is the district going to respond to different COVID-19 scenarios, whether that's about suspected cases or if there's a confirmed positive case in the school setting. And we really base our response on the public health principle of testing, tracing, and isolation, where all test results reported to Massachusetts DPH and come here to the local Board of Health. And for those that test positive, they're self-isolated for a minimum of 10 days, and then they need to identify close contacts. So in a school setting, generally close contacts are students or staff who are within 6 feet of students for at least 10 to 15 minutes. That does not mean somebody you passed by quickly in a hallway. It's that 6 feet for 10 to 15 minutes. However, for students who are in self-contained classrooms, that would be any elementary school setting, some of our special education settings, or in some cases in our middle school settings where students are more self-contained, meaning they're not mixing and matching between classes, where they're with the same group all day long. All students and staff within the cohort would be identified as close contacts of a positive case. That time frame for close contact starts 2 days prior to the onset of symptoms or the date of a positive test. And this is why one of the really big important preventative health measures we want to talk about is really ensuring that if students are not feeling well, if staff are not feeling well, stay home. We don't want to encourage behavior where people are playing hero and coming in when they're sick, whether that's being students or staff. Just around the concept of close contacts, we dealt with this back in the spring when we saw our first positive cases in the community. Close contacts only go one level, which means that if I were to test positive and Jill is one of my close contacts, she would have to be quarantined, but Jill's close contacts would not need to be. It only goes to those people who had direct contact with the individual. So the steps for close contacts is they should not come back to school until they've received a negative test result or they've elected to self-quarantine for 14 days and have not developed symptoms. It's important to note that all of this medical guidance, by the way, you can find on our website. If you go to our reopening page, there's a link to the DESE protocols around COVID-19 scenarios. And so that's the self-quarantine for 14 days. And it's at least 4 to 5 days after the identification of contact. Go ahead, Jill.
And sorry to interrupt. I put a link in the Q&A to that document on our webpage because a couple questions came in about what happens if someone is tested positive.
Okay, thank you, Jill. I appreciate that. Actually, if one of you can throw that in the chat too, because it may get lost in the Q&A over time, but just throwing the COVID link in the chat would be helpful too, please. Thank you. And again, there's much greater detail than what's here in these slides, and that link is about a 19-page document from the Department of Ed on that front. So if a close contact is tested, if they're positive, we would obviously go through the contact tracing piece again. And if the test is negative, the student or staff member can return to school if they're asymptomatic and wearing a mask. So common elements for any suspected case is that we want to evaluate symptoms. That's our nursing staff would do that in schools. And we're actually working to beef up our nursing staff in schools. So we have at least 2 members that are available in every, two nursing staff members that are available in every school. So looking to evaluate symptoms, we would separate the suspected individual from others. We would clean and disinfect spaces. And there will be a separate isolation area established in each school for suspected cases where students would remain isolated until picked up by their parents. A staff member who's suspected would obviously just go home. But students would need to remain isolated until they're picked up by their parents. And again, that's why we need 2 bodies in each building, so that we could have 1 person running the regular nurse's office and 1 person running the isolation area. And part of the reason we want to make sure it's a completely separate area, we know we have students who need to visit the nurse for regular treatment, and we don't want to run any risk of cross-contamination. I'm not going to go through this, but this is just an example of one of the pages of guidance that you can see in that document that's been linked in the chat and the Q&A. It walks through the steps. If somebody's symptomatic, test negative, test positive, not tested, what are the steps that need to be followed? So one of the big questions is, what happens if there's a positive case in a school? Does the school close down? Does the classroom close down? What's the steps here? And I think if there is 1 individual confirmed case in a school, that is not something that would close a school down entirely. Now, again, if there's an individual in a classroom that's a self-contained cohorted classroom, everybody in that classroom would be identified as a close contact, and those contacts would need to be quarantined, which essentially means that that classroom would not continue to meet in person and would continue with remote learning. In a hybrid model, it would only be those individuals that were part of the cohort that were in contact. I know we got a question about this ahead of time. So if a cohort A individual tested positive, cohort B would not be impacted. Obviously, we'd make sure that we did the deep cleaning that were necessary associated with that. But the teacher would, and so we would work with a substitute in that case and support remotely with that from the teacher in that classroom. But if there is suspected in-school transmission, then we would consult with the Billerica Board of Health. We have excellent partners here in the Billerica Board of Health on the next steps, which might be closing part of a school. For example, if we're 1 wing in a school that we're isolated to a grade level, potentially closing an entire school. If there's transmission across multiple schools, the district for a period of time, which could be a short period from 1 to 3 days up to a full 14-day quarantine period. And any of those decisions need to be actually done in consultation with the Department of Education. It is also really important to note that we need to look at what's happening not from just a school perspective, but what's happening with the community and regional health data. And if cases continue to uptick within a community or region, we would want to identify if that triggers closure. I will say, because we got some questions around this, about what are the objective criteria for determining if schools close. It's unfortunate at this point that there are not those criteria defined by the state, whether that's by the Department of Public Health in the state or by the governor's office or by DESE. I know that as superintendents, we're advocating on basically a daily basis for a defined metric to come out to say if transmission rates are at or below this level, then we should be in-person schooling, and if they're above that level, then we should be remote. Until that time, we're left to some individual district-based decisions, but I'm hopeful that there's going to be some progress on that front. So that there's consistency in whether that's done on a community-by-community basis or on a regional basis. That's something that would need to be decided by the state leaders in that area.
Tim, can I ask a question that was asked about, you talked a bit about what would lead to school closure, but what about full return? I know the state hasn't given specific guidance around that, but can you respond to that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's different kinds. I mean, full return without any restrictions, back to where we were in February. That's a post-vaccine world, right? And that does not seem to be on the near horizon. But in terms of transitioning from remote to hybrid or transitioning from hybrid to full return, what I would say is I think similarly, it would be great to have some defined metrics from the Department of Education on that front. When I talk about the models in a second, some of that is going to depend upon comfort level as it relates to physical distancing, and are we in the 3 to 4 foot range or in the 6 foot range? Again, the challenge is that there is not an objective metric right now, but we are significantly pushing for one to be defined statewide on that front. So let me start talking about the three models, and people I think have seen some of these before. There's actually a new slide in here where I wanted to try to combine all three models together. But we're required by DESE to produce three models: a full in-person model, a hybrid model, and a full remote model. And as I said in our goal, we have an obligation to provide remote learning for some students, where it may be a student has underlying medical needs. They may have a family member who may be immunocompromised, where it's not recommended for the student to return to school, or families just having the option to choose remote learning because that's what's best for them. So one of the things that we did very early on in this process, once we got the guidance from DESE in late June, is that we looked at the analysis of our physical spaces in the buildings, given that DESE gave us guidance that we could return students to school with a 3 to 6 foot physical distancing range. So if we are looking to accommodate all of our students at the same time in a full in-person model, we can do it in a 3 to 4 foot physical distancing range, but we don't have enough physical space in our buildings to return all students to full in-person in a 6 foot physical distancing range. We can, however, return about half of our students in that 6 foot range, and that's the hybrid model that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So in a full in-person model, students would be physically in school for full days each day. We would have to limit class size to approximately 20 in person. I know in some previous presentations I've shown pictures. If there's a request, I can pull some of those back up again, but it's not in this slide deck. But physical distancing classrooms would be in the 3 to 4 foot range, but to accommodate class size being limited to about 20, we would need to add additional classes in many different areas of the building. In elementary school and middle school, we need to reassign some coaches and some specialists. And at the high school level, it would require the elimination of some electives. Essentially what that would be, because I know we got some questions about what electives would be reduced. It's hard to answer that with complete specificity, but it would generally be, upper grade level electives that have lower enrollment. We would need to pull teachers out of those areas to reduce class sizes in core classes that are requirements for graduation. So what that might look like is there might be an advanced science class that might not be able to be taught, so that an additional section of biology could be added, just as an example. Or as a math teacher, I used to teach computer science. A computer science class might be eliminated, so I would be available to teach an extra section of Algebra 2. In a full in-person model, we know that lunches require 6 feet of distancing regardless, because students would not be wearing masks when they're eating. And if classrooms are only set up at 3 to 4 feet, we would need to set up additional areas in the building to accommodate food service. That would also have an impact potentially on our food service staff, our nutritional services staff, and our custodial staff, as it would be additional areas to serve in and additional areas to clean. But we would need to set up eating areas in gymnasiums, in cafeterias, in breakout areas, in hallways, and we're certainly looking at outside areas as well too. One of the other challenges, so I talked about the transportation guidance earlier, our bus capacity is limited to about 1/3. So we would need to make multiple bus runs for each school to accommodate bringing students in. That would have an impact on arrival and dismissal times. It would probably have an impact on the length of the learning day for students. And because each of our buses currently does 3 runs, one at the high school, one at the middle school, one at the elementary school level, and each of those would now need to be done twice, that would likely change the start time for middle schools and elementary schools and change the dismissal times as well. Moving to the hybrid model. In a hybrid model, we divide students into 2 cohorts, A and B. And for each cohort, it would be a mix of 2 days a week of in-person instruction, 1 day a week of synchronous remote learning, that's real time, and 2 days a week of asynchronous remote learning. It's probably better described through this graphic here. And so you can see if a student is in cohort A on the top, they would attend full in-person classes on Monday and Tuesday. On Wednesday, they would have scheduled online classes with their teacher. And on Thursdays and Fridays, they'd be remote. They'd be accessing Google Classroom. They'd be watching videos, reading reading things, working with peers, submitting material. One of the questions I was asked at school committee last week was about what happens if students get stuck during those remote learning days. And it's important for us in the model. We took that feedback, and we want to make sure that we provide real-time access to support staff who can help those students get stuck. That might be scheduling, for example, in an elementary school that 11 o'clock on Fridays will be grade 2 math help for any student in a school that wants to participate. And we'll work to schedule staff to support that through the various models. Cohort B would obviously be the reverse of cohort A in this model.
Tim?
Yes, please.
We have a question in relation to cohort A and cohort B, and it is, how are you planning on determining what student falls in which cohort?
So, yeah, I'll talk about this in a slide in a moment. Generally, right now, we are looking at breaking this up alphabetically. We know, however, that there are some places where we're going to need to make exceptions. So for us, I think one of the most important principles is that children in the same household should be on the same schedule. I know I've gotten at least one request from a parent who didn't want their children on the same schedule so they could better support the remote. But I think generally speaking, we will want to have students in the same household on the same schedule. And we know that not every household, children have the same last name, so we need to make some accommodations there. We also may need to make some accommodations to balance class sizes so that in a class of 22, we don't wind up with 16 in cohort A and 6 in cohort B because of the way the alphabet happens to break down with that classroom. So we may need to make some hand changes as it relates to balancing classes, or in some cases related to transportation feasibility.
Tim, can we just give folks a quick reminder to, when they put a question in the Q&A, to remember to make sure their name is included rather than anonymous?
Yeah, thank you. So if you don't have a name typed in, please add a name, and that will help us be able to answer your question if you have one to submit. So thank you for that. Continue with the hybrid model. Hybrid model allows for that 6-foot distancing range in classroom, which we know has been the generally recommended CDC guidance as opposed to what DESE's recent guidance was. Some student activities that can't occur indoors can occur during remote learning days. I did not put it in a slide deck. We talked about it at school committee on Thursday night, but we got guidance around things like chorus, around brass and woodwind instruments, around some physical education activities, around theater. So for example, chorus is something that can only happen outdoors with at least 10 foot of distance between students. That's something that can't occur indoors, but we can work to do choral pieces remotely during some of those remote times. Similarly, instrument lessons or pieces like that. And those, we'd look to schedule those things in. For me, one of the biggest things in a hybrid model is thinking back to what we did with remote learning this spring. What I will say is it was certainly a challenge. And we were building the plane as we were flying it. And anything that we do remotely will be better this fall than it was in spring because we've taken the opportunity to learn from that. But any success we had, it was built upon the establishment of relationships among teachers, students, and their peers that supported a classroom environment that allowed students and teachers to work together. By moving into a hybrid model in the beginning, it would allow us to work to establish those relationships in person if we're forced to go full remote later due to the trajectory of the virus. And one of the considerations of the hybrid model is that some of our students of highest need in separate special education programs or our English language learners have the option to be part of both cohorts A and B, and that's consistent with guidance we have from the Department of Education. So as I mentioned before, in a hybrid model, families would still have the option to choose a remote-only option for their children if that's what's best for them. In the guidance we have from DESE, families could choose to move back and forth between the two models, but there would be a required transition period. When we actually did our tour today, this was one of the questions that came up. If a child is transitioning from in-person to remote, that's actually a much easier transition because they're added to the remote model. If a child is transitioning from remote to in-person, that may take longer because we need to make sure that we set up the proper distancing pieces. So the required transition period from DESE guideline is up to 3 to 4 weeks, but we would certainly look to expedite that where and when that's feasible to do so. Students who select a remote-only option would be supported by VORICA teachers, and we know that we have some staff in a hybrid model where they have their own medical indications to remain remote, and we'd look to match remote-only teachers with remote-only students to support both. In a hybrid model, students that engage in a remote-only option would engage with all the curriculum standards and would be not on an identical track because they're taught in this different model, but they'd be on a parallel track where they're hitting the same curriculum standards. They'd be using a DESE-approved online curriculum, and there'd be required attendance, that's logging in and accessing material, required participation, and required grading. Any questions that are popping up here before we move to the full remote option?
No, a lot of them are falling under, there's some falling under transportation, some, a couple of special ed ones, but I was going to hold those until
okay.
the models.
Yeah, so I'll finish the models, and I think we can get to some of the general Q&A after that. Sounds good. So in a full remote model, all instruction is delivered virtually, and families do not have a choice in a full remote model to opt into in-person school. Class time in a full remote model would be scheduled daily. This was one of the biggest pieces of feedback we heard from the spring, was that there wasn't enough structure and accountability in a remote model, so there would be class time scheduled daily, teachers delivering virtual instruction over Google Meet at the ratio of about 1 to 2 with in-person class time, and all students would be expected to participate in scheduled online classes on a daily basis. I mentioned before our guiding principle is that while we will work to improve remote learning, nothing can fully replace or adequately replace in-person instruction. And I talked a moment ago about the difficulty in developing relationships because teachers would be with new students to start the year. We also know, not only from state data, but from looking at our own information here, that there are challenges with remote learning that disproportionately impact our students with the highest need. And one of the pieces of information we got last week from DESE and was actually reconfirmed with me on a call with the Commissioner of Education this morning is that if Billerica were in a fully remote option, Billerica would likely be ineligible to field any teams in interscholastic sports if there's an MIA season. And so this is a new slide that people have not seen before, but I want to put this up there, and I can kind of leave this up there because it may help with some questions, or I'll come back to it, I think, when we finish. Just contrasting physical distancing, the learning model, parental choice, electives, transportation, and sports in the full in-person, the hybrid, and the full remote models. So just before I come back to that, and I'll leave that slide up because I think that's what a lot of people are here to see, is looking at those choices. Just talk about our timeline. So on Friday, we had to submit our initial planning models to the Department of Education. We're doing the public forum right now. Please look out. Tomorrow we'll be releasing a family survey. That survey will be open from tomorrow through Friday. In that survey, we're going to ask you in a non-binding way, just to share the name of your student, the name of your child. Please fill it out once for each child, because we realize that if you have a second grader, a fifth grader, and an eighth grader, for example, your choices for those children may be different depending upon their age, what their individual learning styles or situations are. But please only fill it out once for each child, not more than once. But we're going to release a survey tomorrow that will be open through Friday. We're actually running a forum for students on Wednesday that'll be open to high school and middle school students that will go directly to students from the principals in those buildings. And next Monday at 9 a.m., the school committee will conduct a meeting to have a vote on a preferred option for the fall, because that August 10th is the deadline to submit our plans to DESE, and we'll share those comprehensive plans publicly with the community that night. We are delaying that as long as possible, knowing that the situation continues to evolve. And I will say that if there is a vote on August 10th and the public health data changes dramatically in one way or the other between August 10th and September, we know we also need to be responsive to that public health data as well too. So let me just come back to this slide, and then I think it's Q&A time.
Okay. Let's see. So talk a bit about special ed. There are questions about children, the plans for children who are on IEPs, and then also there are a couple specific program questions about coming back, if we were in a hybrid, coming back all 4 days for those who are in separate programs.
Yeah, so the second part of that question is a little bit easier because it's a little bit more straightforward, right? So students in our sub-separate programs, that would be Compass, it would be Rise, it would be Lab, it would be Connection, Star, Green and White. I think I hit all 6 of them. Students in those programs would have the option of returning to school all 4 days. It's not necessarily mandated or required that they would be part of both cohorts in a hybrid model, but they would have the option of being part of both cohorts A and B. In general, what's on a student's IEP, we still have an obligation to maintain, whether that's in a full in-person model, whether it's in a hybrid model, or whether it's in a full remote model. How that's delivered is going to look a little bit differently in each model. And in some cases, it's a combination of, let's say in a hybrid model, right? There may be some components of a child's education, of a child's IEP that are best delivered in person. There may be other components that are best delivered remotely. We will work to, in the way that we schedule students, look to maintain cohorts so that if there's a group of students that may, for example, be part of a group, let's say speech therapy session, we'd look to actually group those students in the same classroom for both their general instruction and their speech therapy. So those are some of the pieces that we would put in place there. Yeah, Jill, I don't know if you have anything from your perspective to add to that answer.
No, I mean, it's that special ed is obviously very complicated. So when we put out the plans for our return to school, Ms. Emery, Amy Emery, who's our special ed director, will detail out what that will look like for special ed kids too. This is a bit of a sort of an attendance question in terms of how attendance is classified for students who are out on quarantine because they're waiting for a negative test, for example. Will that be counted against them as a sick day? So maybe talk generally about how attendance will be looked at.
Yeah, so I think our overall approach to attendance is going to look a little bit different. I mean, I know part of what we've heard is since DESE passed some new guidelines around attendance a couple of years ago, we have an obligation under state law and regulation to send out sort of sort of the bad attendance letter, right? You've hit X number of absences, and you get the warning letter that says you're hitting attendance pieces. I think that DESE's guidelines are going to change a little bit on that front. From our perspective, a student, if they're forced to go into quarantine, right? If they are continuing to access learning, and we would want to make sure that that child is still able to access opportunities to engage in their courses and their curriculum. From my perspective, I wouldn't mark that student as absent because they're engaging in the learning process. They're just doing it in a different manner during those days.
So a few transportation questions. This one is about allowing siblings to sit together on the bus, which is, in fact, we would want them to sit together on the bus, right?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this when I did the transportation piece, is that students sitting together, we need to get some clarity, I think, from DESE, because while it's great to put two siblings on the same seat, if I go back to the just the picture that I had before here, right, you can see in this picture, students are staggered aisle, window, aisle, window, aisle, window, and now if you have students sitting next to each other, you're actually closer to the seat in front of or behind you. So that's a piece that we're going to seek out some additional clarity. Again, that came up on our own in-person bus tour this morning, and so that's something we'll get clarity on. One thing I did not mention in regarding the transportation guidelines is so we would actually be looking to have assigned seats on the bus. The reason you have assigned seats is so that that actually helps with identifying close contacts in a bus situation, so that it doesn't change from one piece to another. The other thing is because our buses do multiple runs in the course of a morning or an afternoon, each bus will be essentially cleaned down and disinfected between runs as well. So
there are a couple of questions or concerns about the windows being open, like, for example, inclement weather, students catching eye or ear irritations from open windows. If you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I can't. Quite honestly, I can't necessarily speak to the eye or ear piece, although if that is a concern, then we can potentially look at how we assign seats and put a student in that situation on the aisle as opposed to by the window. But generally speaking, the principle is that windows should remain open on buses to increase air circulation unless it is incredibly inclement weather. That, 20 to 30 degrees probably means that windows remain open on the bus. Regular rain means windows remain open on a bus. Monsoon is a little bit different, but generally windows should be open on the bus, and with rare exceptions to that. One of the things I'll just mention, because I know there are obviously a lot of parents here on the call too. We've talked about wanting to use outdoor spaces. I haven't talked about mask breaks yet. I know that it is important for us to schedule opportunities for students to pull down their masks in the course of the day. while they can maintain 6 feet of distancing. Doing that outside is one of the best ways to do that. And it means that there are going to be times where we're going to be asking students to go outside when it's cold. I have a 15-year-old of my own at home who does not like to wear anything other than shorts. I'm sure a lot of you out there that have any kids, or particularly, between the ages of say 12 and 17, who never like to wear anything but shorts. Make sure your kids dress warm, because they're going to be going outside more than they typically have.
Can you clarify the temperature checking on the way into school? I know Desi had put out guidance around that. There are a couple questions there.
Yeah, so there was some initial guidance early on from the Department of Education that recommended that temperature be taken when individuals are coming in and out of school. And we had actually looked at that point in time of how we're going to do that, knowing there were some logistical challenges. We'd even looked at things like thermal cameras for installation in schools. As the science evolved around this, and as places had experiences with this, it was actually counterindicated, recommended that schools do not check temperatures. And the reason why is there were too many false negatives and too many false positives as it associated with checking temperatures. I know even here at Town Hall, when Town Hall reopened, when people started coming back into Town Hall, there was always a nurse downstairs checking employees' temperatures when they came into the building before it was open to the general public. When that guidance changed, not just for schools, but statewide, that piece was removed. So we would not be doing temperature checks. That being said, one of the things that we will do is we certainly want to make sure that we over-communicate the list of COVID symptoms. You can find that in that same medical guidance that I referenced earlier here. There's a link on the bottom of this page, but you can find this on our website. Actually, I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity just to show folks where to find our new page on our website. So this is the district's main website, billricketk12.com. You can see right here in the middle of the page, right beneath our main links, there's a new fall 2020 school reopening page. And if you click on that, you can see the video series we've been doing, the updates. This presentation will actually be put up on our page here as well too. And you can see this DESI protocols for responding to COVID-19 scenarios. We have some videos here like symptoms of coronavirus. So this is sort of the one-stop shopping for people to go to as they're looking for information.
Can you, I think you touched on this, but clarify the communication about, so if a student is tested positive, what will be the communication that goes out?
Sure. Just find the slide here. So in terms of the close contacts, I mean, everything is reported to DPH and the local Board of Health. That being said, we also know that, sometimes it is much faster to do that through our own tracing. So we have an obligation and are identifying a COVID-19 lead in each building. Part of the responsibility in each school is to identify for students, to really work with families around students who are absent. Why are they absent? If there is a positive case, immediately doing the tracing from our end as well too, and working in conjunction with the Board of Health here, so that we can know that as soon as possible. When I even think about things like the bus, we have cameras on all of our buses to help identify close contacts there. All of our classrooms would have assigned seating so that we can identify who those contacts are within a classroom setting. As I mentioned before, if it's a self-contained classroom, it would be the whole classroom. So that's the work that we would do to support that close contact on our end. We would similarly want to make sure that we're engaging with those students, or for that matter, staff members that are identified as close contacts, encouraging them to get testing, go through that process. I'll speak to this from a level of personal experience. I think people in this community may have seen that our town manager tested positive a few weeks ago. I was identified as one of his close contacts. I had to quarantine for 14 days. I reached out to my primary care. I was tested through my primary care. I came back negative, and then returned to work after that period of time, after the 14-day period. So it's important that we follow these steps because it's about reduction of any spread in the event if there's a positive case.
A question about substitutes. So if a teacher is out, in terms of class coverage, how will that be handled?
Yeah, so I mean, clearly we know that if a teacher is out for whatever reason, as they would be in any typical situation, we need to have somebody else in the classroom to support those students. We are looking at the option of hiring building-based subs so that we're keeping a sub that would be essentially at the ready in a school on a regular basis. You know, in the past we've had subs that can often be assigned to multiple schools. I think in the interest of cohorting, we want to try to keep any substitutes within the same building so that they're not mixing schools. We know we have some itinerant staff that move schools, and you know, we'll work to accommodate that. But for substitutes, we want to make sure that's within the same building. We also know that we have some staff members in the building that may not be providing direct service, direct instructional service to students that can act as substitutes in a case that we're not able to find, whether they're permanent or day-to-day subs on a given basis.
So a question about isolation spaces. So talk generally about how that will be handled with the different nursing spaces, but specifically if more than one student is suspected of having COVID-19 at the same time, will there be separate isolation spaces for each student?
So that's a piece, it depends. So I know that we'll need to obviously maintain the isolation. If we need to set up, at least on a temporary basis, multiple spaces, we will find the space to do that if there are multiple suspected cases at the same time. In terms of where we set up those spaces, it's a little bit different building by building. We want to set up a secondary space that's in close proximity to the nurse's office, but not like a separate place within the nurse's office, right? Because if it's within the nurse's office, then you're coming in through the same door, and we want to make sure that we don't do that. So one example at the, I think a lot of people, whether or not they have students there or they've been in there for other events, the high school, we have a nurse's suite that's there by the main entrance. Next door to that is a room that is, or right down the hall from that is a room that we use for alternative physical education. A lot of that stuff is not going to be able to happen in in-person schooling. That's an area that we would potentially set up as an isolation area because it's in near proximity. That's something that's a big enough space that we can segregate different components of that room to support multiple students if we had to.
Another facilities related question. If students are changing rooms for each class, you already talked about the Wednesday cleaning day, right? No,
I didn't. You know what? Let me bring up the hybrid model because I meant to talk about it but didn't, and I think it's a really important consideration for why the model looks this way. Is the reason it would be Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, Friday with Wednesday synchronous remote is two reasons. One is from the feedback we received from parents early on in the process, is that having a set schedule every day of the week helps from a childcare perspective so that you know that if your child is doing in-person instruction on Mondays and Tuesdays, those are the days where you can, where schools are taking your students. But the other days, if there's a need for childcare, that would be taken on a set regular schedule as opposed to a week on, week off model. The other thing in this model is that Wednesdays are days where we would do deep cleaning in each building with our custodial staff to make sure that that cleaning took place between cohorts. So cohort A is in for 2 days, deep cleaning of the buildings, cohort B in for 2 days, and then another deep cleaning that occurs either Friday night or Saturday with our staff. Again, using some of those tools that I talked about in the PPE and cleaning slides earlier.
And then the other cleaning question is about students who are changing rooms for classes, and are desks going to be cleaned, disinfected after each class? Yeah,
so we, it's funny because I've been involved in discussions with high school students in a couple of these scenarios. One was I served on the state's reopening advisory committee. We had a couple of student representatives on there at the state level, and then we have a high school student on our district-wide reopening group right now. What would happen is that we would be asking students to come in, or asking students before they leave to wipe down their areas, and then we would be asking students when they come in to wipe down their areas, right? So there's 2 sets of cleaning that would take place in between sessions for students that change classes. That is really predominantly happening at just the high school level. At the elementary level, students are staying within the classroom. They would not be going down the hall for specials like art or health like they have in the past. Those teachers would be coming into the room, again, to minimize that impact. That's generally going to be happening for the most part at the middle school level as well too, where students are coming in, our students are staying and teachers are coming in. But there's sort of that double level that would happen when students leave a classroom and when students would come into a classroom.
Question about food allergies and how that will be handled with lunch.
Yeah, I mean, we recognize that, we need to be responsive to the food allergies that a student may have in the same kind of way that we establish, that in a classroom setting. When I'm thinking about like an elementary level, when we have there may be a peanut allergy, for example, in a classroom, and we need to make an indication around snacks that come into that classroom. The same principle applies here, is that it's a question of notification. Certainly any student that has an allergy is not identified because that their health and privacy rights are protected. But students in that class would need to be identified that they're not able to, that there's an allergy, students and families. Actually, while we're on the subject of notification, I didn't say this when I talked about these protocols before. Because if there is a positive case that happens in a school setting, I understand the natural inclination to want to know who. And so, I mean, I will say this repeatedly through this process. We can never release the identity of who a student is who tests positive or is suspected to test positive. Their health rights are protected. Their privacy rights are protected. We will notify those people who are close contacts. All of those notifications will be made essentially by phone. We want to make sure we talk to a live person. It's not leaving a message on an answering machine. We want to make sure we make that direct contact. So if you are a close contact, you will be notified. There will, that will take place. There will likely be a message that goes out that speaks generally about it, saying that all close contacts have been identified. And if you were not contacted, it means that you are not a close contact. But I do just want to be clear up front before there's a situation that occurs, if it does, that we can never release the identity of who an individual is, be they a student or a staff member who tests positive. I only mentioned the town manager a minute ago because he himself released a statement saying that he had tested positive. So I don't think I'm violating his confidence when he spoke about that himself. So.
Tim, can you speak about masks? There are several questions regarding the expectation for masks for both children and adults, and as well as if face shields could be used instead of masks.
Yeah, thank you for that. I didn't put the slides in this deck, and perhaps I should have. The DESE guidelines call for masks to be required for all staff, to be required for all students in grades 2 and above, and recommended for students below grade 2, but required on the bus or van or whatever the transportation vehicle is. From my perspective, making it different on the bus than in school doesn't make sense. We know the important role that masks play in mitigating transmission. It's going to be my recommendation to the school committee that in any in-person scenario, masks are required for all students. There is a Supreme Court case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts from 1905, I believe, that essentially gives the right for public entities to require it in any kind of a case like that. So we would have the ability to do that through policy. The question about face shields. So one of the groups that I've been involved with in my statewide work with the Superintendent's Association, we've been meeting with an organization called Ariadne Labs. When I go back to this slide that I used before for the balanced view of risk, this actually comes from something called the Parabola Project, which was developed in conjunction with Ariadne Labs and the Learning Accelerator. Ariadne is a group, it's doctors that are a joint venture with Brigham and Women's Hospital and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And we talked about face masks with that group a little while ago, or face shields with that group a little while ago. Face shields are designed to be worn in conjunction with a mask and not in place of a mask. They don't provide the adequate protection to work against virus transmission. So in and of themselves, they are not a suitable alternative. Now, that being said, continuing the piece about masks, we know that there are some students, and these exceptions are going to be rare, where the student may have a medical condition. For example, there may be some respiratory medical condition, or in, again, some cases where a student, due to behavioral and sensory issues, may not be able to wear a mask. We recognize that, and we know that those exceptions will be made on an individual basis. We also know from our work with the medical professionals that the one student or two students in a classroom that are not wearing a mask It does not significantly impact the overall risk of transmission. It works the same way that herd immunity works with vaccination. Essentially, herd masking is equivalent to herd immunity in that case. So that's sort of a general overview around masks. I think I got at most of the question. But I don't know if there's other ones that are still popping up there or not.
Okay, so there's a question about remote learning. Actually, there were a couple. One was, and around consistency specifically. Would there be consistency for each grade? Meaning, would teachers be assigning the same work, et cetera? And then also answered about the technology piece in terms of like the platforms that teachers use.
Yeah, so I put these slides in the back here. So let me use these. And I mentioned this before. The top concern that was expressed about remote learning when we did the surveys of both students and staff back in June was that we needed to have more structure and accountability with the experience. And that whatever we're going to do with remote learning had to provide a more robust experience. And this question about consistency, we're looking to standardize on Google Meets. We're looking to standardize on Google Classroom, knowing that teachers may build a little bit more off of that depending upon their individual circumstances. But as a go-to tool, that should be the same for students, regardless of building, regardless of grade, in terms of that format. I mentioned before that we have an obligation under the guidance to progress with state curriculum standards, track daily attendance, participation, grade, meeting the time on learning requirements. And I do just want to acknowledge that remote learning is not the same as online learning. It could be synchronous, which is scheduled, asynchronous, not scheduled, offline, which is independent, and that quality remote learning incorporates all of those formats. To the question about scheduled time. So in a full remote model, whether that would be how the year starts or because we transition into a full remote model because the health situation escalates, what essentially we would do is we would take the regular in-person schedule and convert it using about a 1-to-2 conversion ratio of in-person learning to scheduled face-to-face online learning. So this is probably easiest to, well, let me give 2 examples. One is at the elementary level. So at the elementary level where students are in class for, if you take away recess time and lunch time, there's maybe about 5 hours of instructional time in a given day, face-to-face instructional time. So what that might look like in that 2-to-1 or 1-to-2 ratio, they might have an hour scheduled class with the teacher in the morning. They might have an hour scheduled class with the classroom teacher in the afternoon, and there might be a half an hour special, let's say, in the middle of the day. Now, again, whether it's the middle of the morning, afternoon, that's going to depend upon things like teacher scheduling, but that's something it might look like for one individual student. The question is what happens in that other time? That other time is students, it's not, some of that will obviously need to be some break time for students, but that's students working independently. If you walk into any classroom in the district, there are times when there's teachers-led instruction and there's times when there's student-led learning. And so what we want to do is we want to prioritize that in-person time, whether it's in-person face-to-face or in-person remote, on the teacher-led pieces, and then give students that time for independent work with that ability to check back in with the teacher. Did I get all the impacts of the questions that were asked there, Jill, or are there pieces that you want to add? Because you, in your role, you work a lot with this directly, working with our curriculum people as well.
Yeah, I think one question and that came through was about parents. This obviously has to do with parent schedules. Would they have any say on what time live or virtual meetings are?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, we can't. I mean, you're right. Thank you for raising it. I mean, in any kind of remote model, whether that the district being in full remote or parents choose, or the hybrid component of the hybrid model, parents have a role in supporting their children's learning. Period, and that role actually increases when the child is remote. I think any parent in this district or any parent anywhere in the country realized that in the months between March and June. In terms of being able to schedule when those online classes take place, we really don't have the ability to do that because we have to lock in teacher schedules, and it happens at a given and particular point in time, right? And we can't, if we're matching up teachers with their classes, that has to happen at a set fixed time. And when I talked before what that looks like at, let's say, the high school level where students are in multiple classes, we would lock that in so that period 1 takes place within this chunk of time. Period 2 is this chunk. Period 3 is this chunk, because we know that, student A and student B might be in the same English class in period 1, but one student might be in math in period 2 and the other student might be in history in period 2. So.
And then another part of that question is, will there be a time when remote learning has to be turned in? So my interpretation is the assignments that kids have to do while they're in their remote learning model.
Yeah, what I would say is, I mean, the question of when work is due, that, you know, part of that is the purview of individual teachers and how they run their classrooms. But what I would say is, when we have scheduled in a full remote model, and I'll come back to hybrid in a second. In a full remote model, I think what we did in the spring, where it's basically all your work is due in once a week, that's not the expectation. The expectation is that there should be regular work produced on a regular basis that's consistent with what the learning expectations are for that particular grade level, and what that content area is. So in some cases, that would be daily work that's coming in that's commensurate with the participation in daily classes. In other cases, it may be longer periods of time if they're more complex assignments. You know, that would be done different ways depending upon the nature of what's being taught. In a hybrid model, I just want to go back to you know, this piece here. Theoretically, I mean, again, teachers will have, it's part of the art of teaching is to figure out the discretion of how to match up the work assignment with what you're asking students to do. But just speaking personally, if I were teaching in this model, I would prioritize when my students' assignments are due would be on the days that they're remote, right? I want to work to emphasize my in-person instruction with them on the days that they're in front of me, and then ask them to be doing you know, the assignments for submission on the days that they're remote.
Now the question came in again about special education needs and the 4 days that they'd be for. And can you just repeat that part just so?
Sure. So, and I want to recognize that there are many more students that are receiving special education students than those that are in substantially separate programs. I'm just going to put the slide up just to identify here. Students in substantially separate programs, which are Compass, RISE, STAR, Green and White, Connections, and Lab, would have the ability, if they choose, to be part of both cohorts A and B, as well as ELL students, because the guidance we have from DESE is to prioritize those students that are of highest need. I do want to recognize that you know, while we would like to be able to accommodate all students in both cohorts A and B, that's essentially what a full in-person return model is. And we wouldn't be able to maintain the 6 feet of physical distancing we talk about in a hybrid model, and we wouldn't be able to address the transportation issues in a hybrid model if we did that for all special education students. It is unfortunate. I want to acknowledge that, right? But I would rather be honest and transparent about that answer. I will mention, though, that for students that are receiving special education services in a hybrid model that may not be in a sub-separate program, we would look, as I mentioned before, to identify those places where students are getting additional support during those remote learning days. If we can schedule some things through teletherapy, for example, to do that during remote learning days. And I would say that for all students, looking at those things that we can do during those remote learning days, where that's real person contact with support staff, I think that's important. Our student rep to the school committee asked the question Thursday night about accessing their school counselor, guidance counselor for college applications. That's the kind of thing that would make sense to do during those Thursday and Friday sessions if they were in cohort A, or the reverse in cohort B.
Question about curriculum being adjusted for remote learning option as it was last spring. So this might have to do with the standards, how they identified the prerequisite standards.
Yeah, so the expectation from DESE is, well, let me step back for a second. Back in the spring, when we kept getting changing guidance from the Department of Ed, right? Which I think was, as I said when I started this presentation today, you know, when we first went out, we thought it was going to be a couple of weeks, and then we thought it was maybe a month, and then it turned into the whole year, and then we thought things were going to be fine by September, and here we are. But the guidance from DESE became focus on those standards that are essentially power standards for moving forward. The guidance we have from DESE at this point is not that. It is to focus on the full curriculum across the board, pre-K to 12, moving forward with that, regardless of whether or not we're in an in-person option, a hybrid option, remote choice, or a full remote option. is to proceed and move forward with the curriculum.
Tim, there are a few questions coming in regarding when will school be open, if we have a date already.
Yes.
And part two to that would be, where and how will the parent be able to make a choice if they want to do remote versus hybrid?
So let me put this slide up. Last week, it was announced that there was an agreement reached between the Department of Ed and basically the state teacher unions to provide 10 days of additional training prior to the start of the school year, and it modified the time on learning requirements. That last bullet point there is instruction must start no later than September 16th. And that any change has to be through approval of the school committee. What I will tell you is that our teachers their work year starts on August 31st per contract. 10 working days after August 31st takes us to September 15th. So although this has not been formally voted by the school committee yet and will be on Monday, I would fully anticipate that the first day of school for students will be Wednesday, September 16th, 2020. Again, that is not official until it's voted by the school committee, but I spoke about that with the committee on Thursday night, and I fully expect that will be the first day of school. The question about when do parents choose whether or not they're choosing a remote option. So let me go back to the sort of the timeline piece here. So on the survey that I release tomorrow, we're going to ask you to make a choice, but that is not a binding choice. That's going to help us for our planning purposes to identify, what percentage of students are looking to go remote. And the way we're going to ask that question, we're actually going to ask you to rank all three choices by preference. And then we're going to ask you if we were full in person. And again, this slide is actually part of the survey. If we're full in person, would you choose to send your child to school or take the remote option? If we were in a hybrid model, would you choose to send your child to school or would you choose the remote option? And obviously, if it's full remote, then there's no choice. It's just full remote. So we will ask that question in a non-binding way tomorrow, and that survey will be open through Friday. Once we have that planning, as we move a little bit further on, we don't have a defined date yet, but it's going to be in the back half of August. We will ask that question again, but in a binding way for families. So that's your first opportunity is this week. That's going to help us plan. But if you change your mind in either direction, you still have time to do so over the next few weeks, knowing that, again, the public health situation continues to evolve.
Can you clarify, Tim, the 1-to-2 ratio that you mentioned around the remote learning time, and just clarify the rationale behind that?
Yeah, so, essentially what that is that, and I used an elementary example before, I'll use a high school example now, right? So if a class is typically scheduled from 8 to 9:30 in the morning, then that class might meet remotely from 8 to 8:45. The reason that that's a 1-to-2 ratio as opposed to just a straight ratio, if you're like me and you've been on Zoom meets nonstop, the capacity to be on the Zoom for that period of time, whether it's Zoom, Google Meet, any kind of virtual session, right? I know we got some questions about why Google Meet instead of Zoom, and I can address that in a second. But if you are in any kind of these online virtual forums, your capacity to maintain attention diminishes after, I would say, at a much more rapid pace than it does in person. At the same time, the kind of cues that teachers can use to redirect students' attention in person don't exist in the same way in a virtual world, whether it's walking up to a student's desk or doing something to gather their attention other ways. So to maintain sort of the crispness of instruction and balancing what's teacher-led versus what's student-led, that's why that 1-to-2 ratio exists. So that, again, let's say an 85-minute class at the high school might become a 45-minute online class with the teacher with another 40 minutes of expected work for that student doing it independently. So yeah, it's not amount of work goes 1-to-2, but it's the amount of virtual meeting time goes 1-to-2. Just to address the Google Meet versus Zoom issue, although Zoom has worked to improve some of their privacy, there are still some concerns there. as it relates to protecting student data. Running through Google Meet, it allows us to make sure that we have a consistent platform that integrates across all platforms, and that's why we've made the choice we made.
Is this your first full remote slide, or do you have one or two?
This was the first slide.
Okay, just talk about the first bullet if you can review that part again.
Oh, meaning all instructions delivered virtually?
Yeah, it sounds like, I think people are thinking they don't have a choice in anything. So if you can just sort of clarify where the choice is and where it isn't.
Yeah, so in a full remote model, basically, I mean, you're right. Families don't have a choice to opt for in-person. Students would have an expectation to participate in scheduled online classes daily. We realize that this has an impact on working families. But there is an expectation that in a fully remote model, that's how students are accessing material. It is a challenge. We know that one thing I have not mentioned is in terms of technology access. We distributed Chromebooks and part of what we would do as we move to the end of August is doing community need surveys as well too, right? We identified families that needed technology support in the spring. We allowed families to keep those Chromebooks throughout the summer. They would maintain them. If we have new families that have come up, we would do that this fall, prior to September 16th, distribute technology to support that. But students would have that expectation to participate in scheduled online classes daily. If they don't participate, it's like it's an absence. Students would be able to make up that work, but then we would work with families to identify ways to support their ability to participate in those online scheduled classes, just as we would with a student in in-person school who was having attendance issues.
Can you go back to under the hybrid model and the 2 remote days, speak to what the 2 days look like by way of support for especially younger elementary school kids? Will there be, it's referred to as parent-led teaching, so I think it's a matter of talk about where the support would be from the school side and the role you mentioned before, the role of the parent is there when there is remote learning at home, but what does that look like for them?
And I'm just from a technical perspective here as it relates to the forum, I see that people keep popping up and raising their hands. I know if you had missed it earlier, we're not taking live questions through hands, so questions, please submit them through the Q&A. We know we're not going to get to all of the questions. I think there's 188, it looks like, in the queue right now. And I think that some of them may have been asked multiple times in multiple formats, but we're going to keep those and try to do an FAQ as well. So what that remote learning time looks like. So that and I'm just going to use cohort 8 because it's the top line. So Thursday and Friday would not be scheduled classes online in the same way the remote learning model happens, with the exception that there may be some things like when I talked about activities like chorus, for example, or some other specials, those might get scheduled remotely where they wouldn't be happening in person. But aside that, we would look to utilize staff within our buildings to provide access to real-time support for students that need it. So a model like that might look like students that need, in an elementary level, help with math. There might be a staff member identified who would be available. And don't lock me in on this, right? This would need to be worked at the building level upon who staff availability is. But it might be, let's say, from 8:30, or let me use 9 to 10, any kindergarten student in that school can access a staff member to support challenges with kindergarten math. From 10 to 11 might be grade 1. From 11 to 12 might be grade 2, something like that. So there will be opportunities to access in-person staff remotely through those days where the students are not receiving in-person instruction to support those students that, for lack of a better phrase, get stuck with what they're being asked to do at home. One other piece that I'll mention, because I saw this in some of the pre-forum questions, but I haven't asked yet, is around before in school care and off day care. So we have a great partnership in this community with our Boys and Girls Club. We've been in regular conversation and contact with our Boys and Girls Club in town. We also have been running at the elementary schools our own before school program over the last few years. So in speaking with the Boys and Girls Club, they will not be running their early bird program. There are some new requirements placed upon them, including transportation. It means they will not be able to do that. But we will be looking to expand, and we'll not just, not just looking to, We will be expanding our early morning program in all of our elementary schools. Information will be out in the not so distant future, but to accommodate students that need before school care. And the Boys and Girls Club will be running their after school programs, their fun club programs in our elementary schools for after school care, again, supporting those families whose students are attending school in person and need that piece. And our conversation with the Boys and Girls Club, they're also looking to set up, and we realize they are going to be limited to a certain number of families, and that will not be possible for all families, but they're looking to set up spots at the club during each day of the week to support students during the day and not just before and after school times, where they can similarly provide supports to students in their remote learning during those times. I can't speak for how many spots they're going to have. I know they're still working through that, but we're happy to have that partnership with them to provide that option for some families in the district who will need it.
You just talked about Boys and Girls Club, right?
I did.
Okay. So this one is about curriculum or curricular programming by a third party. If full remote, will instruction be provided by district teachers or by a third party? And I would answer this both in the case of if district is full remote, and then also if district is another model like hybrid and a family's full remote.
Yeah, so this is a piece that's particularly complicated here, and perhaps I should have put a slide in that speaks to this directly. So I will. Actually, you're going to watch me type real time, so I have a blank slide here. So I'm just going to put this into a. I'll put this into a blank slide here. So remote curriculum. So in a full remote model, students would be taught by BPS teachers using synchronous instruction and support from local curriculum. And that's true for either starting the year in full remote or, actually, let me just mark this as full remote. True for either starting the year in full remote or as a transition from hybrid to full remote due to virus trajectory. And then there's the remote option curriculum, which is supported by BPS staff, parallel address of learning curriculum standards, supported by third-party platform using a DESE contract. So essentially what this means here is that if the school year were to start fully remote, or if we were in a hybrid model and we transitioned to fully remote, we'd be using our teachers to teach students using that model of scheduled classes. But if parents and families are choosing a remote option when there's in-person learning taking place, then we would not have the availability of staff to teach in that scheduled way, because those staff are in their classrooms teaching their students. And so we would identify staff members to support that, but the content would be provided by a third-party vendor. An example of one of those third-party vendors, some people may be familiar with Virtual High School. That's one of them, where students would have access. They'd be, I think if there's educators on the call, we talk about curriculum instruction all the time, but I think that's not always necessarily known by parents what the difference is here. And so what we're talking about is that students would still be expected to learn the same things in either model, but the way they would learn it would be different in the two models, right? There would still be learning experiences that would lead to what students are able to do in the same way, but how we achieve that standard looks different in those two models. So I hope that helped address that question. I feel better without a title on the slide here, so I feel better if I put something on the screen. So.
Tim, can you address, there are a few questions regarding the cleaning supplies that will be used and what these chemicals are, particularly for kids with allergies. Can you talk a little bit about the cleaning in general?
Yeah, I mean, I will freely admit that I'm not an expert in the chemical composition of the cleaning supplies that we use in the district. But I do know that, speaking generally, there are certain federal guidelines on materials that cannot be used in a school setting, knowing the susceptibility of children. I mean, Robin, I don't know if you have anything in particular to add from the operational side, knowing that it's really our facilities director can speak to this better than anyone, but
Yes.
Robin, I don't know if you have anything particular to add.
We are identifying the appropriate products based on the guidelines. We had talked about also, we have another bunch of questions on ventilation and what we're doing in the building. So we could probably put some guidance out and let people know exactly what we're doing and the list of chemicals that will be used. But certainly.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Robin.
But certainly these are appropriate chemicals that are used to clean, and safe for children.
Yeah. So I just realized I had a light on in the office, would work better when it was light outside, but now that it's dark, I had to change my lighting in here. On the ventilation question, so yeah, I have not specifically addressed it here. If somebody can throw into the chat, it's probably a good place to put it, the link to the DESE guidance around facilities and operations. So there's a bunch of guidance in there around ventilation. That'll be linked on the website. Our HVAC contractor has been going around working with our individual schools, looking at how we're increasing airflow. We're looking, for example, I had a conversation with one of our principals today where we know we have some interior classrooms. We're going to work to prioritize not having classes in interior classrooms of the building and rescheduling where we have things within a building. So we're using classrooms that have access to outside airflow through windows. So that's some of the work that we're doing on the ventilation front. But again, the link in the guidance is more explicit about the steps that need to be taken as it relates to ventilation.
Another set of questions here regarding the opportunity for orientation and meeting your teachers for kindergartners, for 8th graders, 5th graders.
Yeah, so I mean, in any scenario, whether we are remote, hybrid, or full in person, essentially access to the building by outsiders is going to be limited. And outsiders, unfortunately, includes parents. So we will not be able to do orientations the same way we have in the past. We are looking at essentially creating virtual orientations. So that would be like virtual tours of classrooms, getting a chance to meet your teacher remotely in a way that you hadn't before. And again, I think that applies regardless of which model we wind up in. That's something we're looking to do.
I have a question about the role of the Board of Health and how they are involved in reopening and all these decisions.
Yeah, so again, I want to give thanks to Crystal Bennett, who's the director of the Board of Health here, who is a great resource for the community. Really, what it comes down to is what we're developing. We're working with them in conjunction to make sure that, I mean, we're all following the same rules and guidelines as a whole right now. But where their impact is really more felt is if we're seeing something as it relates to community transmission, where things become different. We have not really hit that point in town, and I'm hoping that we don't. And if I can give one piece of advice to everybody that's listening in on this call, follow the guidelines that are out there, wear masks, maintain social distancing. If you want your kids back in school in any capacity, that's the best thing you can do is follow the general public health guidelines. But above and beyond that, their role is to support us if there are suspected cases, if there are positive cases, to do the contact tracing and to review our plans as we develop them. So that's their role.
Professional development for remote learning for teachers?
Yeah, so I talked about the 10 days of, I'll come back to here. So an additional 10 days of training prior to the start of the school year. So certainly some of that is going to be around health and safety protocols. One of the things I have not talked about yet tonight is, how hallways or stairwells might be one way. They might be one way, or we might have, we were at the Hajar today and we put down, the principal over there put down essentially lanes on the floor so that one side of the hallway is one way and the other side of the hallway is the other way, because there's really only one road in and out when you get down that building, but the hallways are wide enough to do that. So some of the, or things like how do other in-person protocols work. But some of that training will also be supporting what does the instructional model look like. And again, that applies to all three scenarios. How do we work with teachers to support their remote learning being better? And in the same kind of way that we asked families for what worked, we asked staff what worked, and we've been working to share some of those things. We started that work back in the spring before teachers left for the summer, and we're continuing that during that time. But we also know that what classrooms look like in-person instruction need to be different because of the need to maintain distancing, right? Like kindergarten, or in elementary schools, we have circle time at the beginning of the day on the rug in the classroom. We can't have kids sitting in circles on the rug in the classroom, right? So what that looks like needs to be different, and how we support that needs to be different. And that's part of the work that we'll do during those 10 days as well.
Question about recess. What will that look like, or how will that work?
Yeah, so that's one of these things that, and I should speak generally about the planning team. So we do have a district-wide planning team. I mean, we have sort of an internal team that involves a lot of the members of our administration with all of our principals on it. We have a district-wide return to school working group that's got, I believe, 29 members on it, which includes principals, some other administrators, teachers, nurses, parents, community members, has a student on it. There are also working groups in each of our schools. And in each of those schools, that's similarly comprised of parents and teachers to support that. So there is not necessarily one district-wide policy about how recess will work, because other than we know we need to have recess and we know we need to have an opportunity for students to have mask breaks. But what that looks like is going to be a little bit different from each school to each school, depending upon the size of the school, depending upon the accessibility and availability of resources within that school. We know from some guiding principles, again, we want to prioritize outdoor time when we can. Outdoor time will help facilitate the masking. We also know that the way that we need to do recess, we want to make sure that we maintain cohorts that we have in classrooms, so we don't run the risk of transmission across cohorts. You don't want to create cohorts of students and then during recess time have all the kids mixed together as they would have pre-COVID, because then that defeats the purpose of cohorting in the first place. So that one of the things that I've talked about is it might mean that like one group gets the playground, one group gets the gymnasium, one group gets another outdoor space. If, let's say, there's 3 grade 2 classes in the same school and they have recess all scheduled at the same time. So that's being worked out at the individual school level.
A couple questions about the sports again. If you go back to the slide around the eligibility question.
Sure.
And the question is, maybe review that information, but then specifically talk about who makes that decision.
Yeah, so this is not, so the first time I had heard this was on a call last Wednesday with the Commissioner of Education. Actually, let me step back. Before I talk about individual eligibility, ultimately the decision on whether or not to move forward with interscholastic sports is going to be made by the MIAA, that's the state governing body as it relates to high school and middle school athletics, or high school athletics at least, in conjunction with the Department of Education. They have made the decision at this point to delay the start of the fall season until, I believe, September 14th, but have not made a formal decision yet on whether or not fall sports are a go or a no-go. I know that New Hampshire made the decision last week that fall sports were a go, and I know that New Hampshire and Massachusetts works very closely together, but that decision has not been made yet in Massachusetts. But that's something that's made at the state level that's not made locally. Last week, I was on a call with the Commissioner of Education in which he said for the first time that if a district chooses the full remote model, it is extremely unlikely that that district will be allowed to field teams in interscholastic sports if there's a season. And the rationale behind that is if it's not safe for children to come back to school in some capacity, then that district shouldn't be sending children to compete on sports teams. And that information was, I put that out in the school committee on Thursday night after he was fine with sharing that publicly. He was on a call again with commissioners. Commissioner was on a call again with superintendents earlier today, where he reiterated that same position. And then at the back end of that call, answered a question where if a family chose in a hybrid or an in-person model a remote option for their child, it would similarly be unlikely that that child would be eligible to compete on a sports team. Neither of those are decisions that are set in stone at this point. And they are both decisions, both the eligibility of the school as a whole and the eligibility of an individual, that would be made at the state level and are not something that are within our local control here in Dover. So I hope that answered the slew of questions that may have come in on that issue.
Question about just rules and expectations around safety precautions. Would there be a set of rules for all teachers, staff, students around mask wearing, hand washing, distancing, and all of that?
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. When those plans are developed in general and they're developed at the individual school level, again, recognizing that how schools work are going to be a little bit different in terms of like where bathrooms are and how hallways are set up and how timing works, and what works for a 12th grader is different than what works for a preschooler. We need to do things a little bit differently there. But absolutely, there should be common expectations around masks. As I said, my recommendation to the school committee will be that everyone wears a mask pre-K through 12, with the exception of those students for whom it's medically indicated that they should not be. The distancing, again, you can see that various models and what the impact of physical distancing is here, and how we support that throughout the student day. All of those pieces. I know we've gotten some questions in the past about what happens if a student refuses to wear a mask. We treat that the same way that we treat any other issue of noncompliance in a school, is that we work with that individual student from an educational perspective, from a positive perspective. But ultimately what it comes down to is that it is an expectation, it's a policy, it's a rule that needs to be adhered to. And again, there's a 1905 Supreme Court case that gives schools the ability to mandate them.
Tim, a few questions specifically about kindergarten, including when and how will the assessments be conducted, what the start date for kindergartners would be, when it typically is 1 or 2 days after, and just a very general, what will kindergarten look like since it's such a hands-on grade?
Yeah, and I think that last question applies not just to kindergarten, but also to project support preschool as well too. I think it applies in both scenarios. Those are questions we can't completely answer right now, because you're right, it is going to look different, but we're going to work to identify ways to make sure that we have socialization without physical direct impact. And that's some of what's happening there. The question around screening and testing, Jill, you're working with that more directly than I have been. If you can speak to the kindergarten screening piece, please. Yeah,
so I mean, the screening process itself, we had incorporated a group play as part of that process, but we will not be running that, of course, at this time. But otherwise, most of the screening activities are not group oriented, and it's usually like 1-to-1. And it's possible to administer those with the distancing and, of course, mask wearing. The scheduling of that screening is handled at the building level. So principals will be working, if they haven't started already, will be working with parents directly around scheduling that.
Yeah, so the short answer to the question about scheduling is that it has not been fully determined exactly when yet, but that'll be communicated out from the building level to incoming kindergarten parents, correct? Thank you.
I'll note that while Pat's still looking for other questions, and Pat, if you see any that you can jump in. There are a lot of questions around the medical scenarios, so a lot of hypotheticals, what ifs, so what if this, then that. I did put a link to the DESE protocols in the Q&A as well as the chat. So you can always look at that document. It is a dense document, so we are also filtering through that, obviously, to make sense of it so that we put our own protocols in place that are aligned to that. Our team is also working on taking that information and putting it in a slightly more digestible form. So when we have that ready, we'll have that posted. But at least for now, you do have the DESE guidelines around medical scenarios that we will be using as we make decisions about what that will look like in us.
And you've talked about this early on, but addressing it again, the question of if you do choose fully remote, do you have an option throughout the year to change that option as a parent? And then also regarding high schoolers as well, AP courses. Can you talk a little bit about how that would look?
Sure. So it's in the first bullet point here, you can see that in a hybrid model, families have the option. They can move between models, but there would be a transition period that's necessary. So the transition period, and I would say that during that transition period, educational services continue. That's a must, right? I mean, if you choose to switch, there's not a gap in kids learning anything. If a student is transitioning from in-person to in-person, let's say hybrid to remote, that transition period is a little bit quicker because there's not an impact on physical space in the classroom, for example. If a student is transitioning from remote to in-person, that transition period may be a little bit longer because we may need to identify how spaces fit inside the classroom, so we can maintain that 6 feet of distancing in a hybrid model, and also to help transition, because when we talk at that bottom bullet point about there being a parallel track between the curriculum standards, again, students are learning how to do the same thing, but in different ways. We would want to make sure that we create an on-ramp for that student who's transitioning from the remote experience to the in-person experience, so they're not, so we can connect the tissue between those two parallel tracks. This is not dissimilar to what we already do as a district if we have a student move in from another community in the state, where that community is similarly addressing the same curriculum standards, but they may be using different resources. And we would work with that student to identify a way to transition them into the curriculum that we have here. The same principle applies in general.
Great. So I think most of the other questions are either repeated or ones that we are working on, as you've already noted. I will copy the questions also and put it on a document for us to look at and to continue to work on what people are asking. I do want to, though, end with a note of appreciation to someone who put in the Q&A, which says, I meant to add that I think parents would be glad to help out as much as we can in the whole process, or are there anything that we, just to let them know if there's anything that they can help with. So I just want to thank you for that offer. And
and let me say generally, thank you to Jill, you and Robin and Pat for helping facilitate this. I'm sure I just took a quick look at the Q&A just to see how many questions kind of ran through and got answered, and that's not even including the ones that may have been duplicative. Thank you to I still see there's over 200 participants on the line. Thank you to everybody who did their part here. Parents, if you're looking for one of the best things you can do to help us, fill out the survey when we send that out tomorrow. Because that will really help us identify what the pulse of the community is on this issue, and to try to address concerns as they arise. We have an email address, reopen at billricka.k12.com. We have our website, so sorry, it's reopen2020 at billricka.k12.com. I should give you the right email address. We have our website where you can see that email address on there, links to our resources. We're going to continue to populate that. We'll continue to do the video series we've been doing as well too. And again, just keep your questions, keep your feedback coming. As I've said from day one with this, I mean, there is no perfect answer in this scenario, and there's no one answer that's going to work for everybody. So our option is to focus on trying to do what's right for children, focusing on that core value that we all have a collective responsibility for all, and we're going to try to make that happen as much as possible and as best as we possibly can. But thank you for your patience with us. And for sticking with us through this, and we look forward to talking to you all again. Thank you.